so we're going to talk about entities today. First I'll tell you a little bit about me, and shout at me if you can't hear me. Usually pretty loud, but so I've got a computer science background. I've been working with Drupal since 2006, and I consider myself to be a developer, an architect, and also a bit of a project manager. I freelance through my business, Modern Biz Consulting, and I have a focus on complex web application development, which is why I use entities a whole bunch. So what are we going to talk about today? First we'll start talking about how we represent data in D6 versus in D7. We'll move on to talk about what entities are, as well as entity types and bundles, which is all really confusing if you try to read about it. Learn about fields, the Entity API contrib module, not to be confused with the Drupal core Entity API. Then how and why to define a custom entity. We'll get into some examples. How to use entity field query to make queries across different entity types. Defining entity property info or metadata, and why you want to do that. As well as how to leverage entity metadata wrappers. So we're going to start at kind of a high level, and then we're going to drill down and actually get down to the code level and get into some juicy examples. But before we do all that, I would love to find out who is here. So who here is brand new to Drupal? Hands up. Just a few. Don't worry. This is a really technical topic. I'm sure you're going to get some good high-level concepts out of it that'll be beneficial, but don't expect that you're going to go and do all this tomorrow. Lots of other steps first. Who's a site builder? People who use the UI mainly to build sites. Cool. So entities are great things to know about, and you can use entities in the UI in certain ways. We'll talk about that a little bit. Who considers themselves to be a module developer?
I just want to let you know that Dries is on his way. He should be here a little bit for your
Okay.
presentation. We really want to catch this. So
Right. No pressure.
But I'm not kidding about that.
So who considers themselves a module developer? Cool. So you guys are going to love the code here. Hopefully it makes sense. And who's on the business side of things? Awesome. So entities are useful things to know about just because they're another tool in the toolbox. And when you maybe go to a developer, if you're not one yourself, and you want something built, it's good to be able to talk the language and understand why they're talking about entities versus nodes and all that. So who here has actually created a custom entity in Drupal 7? Just a few. Who has not? All right, theoretically you all raised your hand. Okay, so let's talk about data in Drupal 6. So of course, you could start off by just using a custom database table, right? You can use hook schema, I don't know how to pronounce that, hook schema to define all your database tables and columns, and great, you've got a database table. But there's a whole bunch of core data that Drupal defines, right? We've got our users, our comments, files, taxonomy vocabularies and terms, and then nodes. So now nodes are obviously like the thing in Drupal, right? Everybody uses nodes. It's where most of your content tends to be. There are different types of nodes called content types. You've got pages, blog posts, and you can create your own using the UI, the field UI. Now in D7, we have all of those things, but we've got two more that I've added to the list here. So we've got entities, and we've got custom entity types. So kind of what I've done here is I'm going to switch back to the last slide here. So you take users, comments, files, taxonomy stuff, and nodes. Those are all entities in Drupal 7. That's the difference between Drupal 6 and 7 is pretty much everything in Drupal 7 is an entity. However, you can define your own custom entity types, and we're going to do that a little later, and talk about why things are like that in Drupal 7. So entity types are elemental building blocks for pretty much all important data in Drupal 7. Drupal 7 has a lot of database tables. If you ever open up the database, there are a ton of tables. Those are not all entities. They're actually very few. We've actually almost listed all the entities in Drupal 7 if we haven't. But entities are kind of like the core data. They're the things that you tend to work with on a daily basis. They're really interesting. So entity types represent a concept or a noun. Different types of entities store different data. Generally, each entity type stores data in one database table, although it's not always true. So for example, node is a type of entity. It's an entity type. And a few things that you store in the node table are title, body, actually body is not true. That might be a field. But title, created timestamp, and there are a few others. User, another example of an entity type. User, you store usernames, created timestamps, last visit timestamps, a whole bunch of other things. Password. These are all actually in the database table for that entity type. And entities types are defined using hook entity info. So an entity, got a question?
Sorry. Are you going to, or could you post these slides somewhere?
Oh yes, sorry, I meant to say they're posted on SlideShare. If you search for them on SlideShare, you should find them. Good question. And feel free to shout out questions at me. I'm happy to take them. So an entity is an instance of an entity type. So for example, the user JD Leonard, this user ID is an entity. Similarly, the page with the title Drupal Rocks with a given node ID, that is an entity. It's an instance of an entity type. And any entity can be loaded with the entity load function. So for example, here I'm loading actually two nodes. So I'm doing entity load, and then I say what the entity type is, because Drupal needs to know what table to get these nodes out of. I say node, and then the IDs, the entity IDs, which in this case are node IDs. So that will return an array with two nodes. And then core also provides some convenience wrappers. So node load and user load are examples. They're just kind of easy to deal with, and sometimes those wrappers do other things in addition to just wrap the entity load function. But in Drupal 7, for the most part, they don't do too much else. So then entity bundles are basically subtypes of an entity. So for example, we deal with pages and blog posts pretty frequently in Drupal. Those are content types. Content type is analogous to an entity bundle. So a page is a bundle for the node entity type. I'll say that one more time. So a page is a bundle on the node entity type. So you've got all these nodes, you've got a bunch of different content types. Those are all different bundles. But not all entity types have multiple bundles. It's a feature, but it's not always there. So for example, users don't have any subtypes. A user is a user is a user. The concept stands on its own. And so you really don't need, different types of users that store, have different kind of data associated with them.
Would roles be bundles?
Sorry?
Like user roles? Would roles be considered bundles?
A role is not a bundle. A role is just another type of data that's actually doesn't happen to be an entity.
Okay.
That's not an entity, it's just another Drupal concept, and Drupal provides a bunch of functions and hooks that deal with roles, kind of the user subsystem. Good question. So why do we need all these entity bundles? Well, if you've got some experience, you can probably guess some of this, but we talked about each entity type storing data in some table. Just a definition here, we call those pieces of data properties. So those are entity properties. So the different columns in the node table correspond to entity properties for the node. So title, body, author, which actually is UID, and created timestamp are examples of properties. But not all nodes are created equal. We've got pages, which may have some data that are, it needs to store data beyond what we store in that node table. Because remember, that node table only stores a certain number of things, and it doesn't know all the things, all the data you want to store. And blog posts, for example, typically they have tags with taxonomies and stuff like that, which are all associated. So we need fields. I would guess that most of you have used fields. whether it was in Drupal 6 when it was called Content Construction Kit, which allowed you to basically build fields. So that was a contrib module in Drupal 6 that lets you store additional data per content type. Now remember, a content type is specific to nodes, so it's really just about nodes. So for example, the 5-star module, which is a contrib module that leverages the CCK API, allows nodes to be ranked. So think 1 through 5 stars on a page or a blog post. Now in Drupal 7, that concept has evolved to what are now known as fields. It's a core concept, so it's in Drupal core, and the difference here is whereas with CCK you were storing data, additional data per content type, now you're storing it per entity type. And remember, now there are all these things that aren't nodes that are also entities. So users, for example. In Drupal 6, you couldn't add fields to a user. You had to kind of come up with some other concept if you wanted a profile that had a bunch of profile data. So you had modules like profile 2, content profile. I might be messing up some of the names here. They might do different things. But you kind of had to come up with all these sort of hacked solutions. But in Drupal 7, we apply the power of CCK to all the different entity types. So if we take 5-star in Drupal 7 as an example, that leverages the core field API. There's no CCK in Drupal 7 for the most part. It's all fields now, and it's in core. And so 5-star in Drupal 7 allows entities of any type to be rated. So you can not only rate pages and blog posts, but you might also be able to rate users or comments or any other custom entities that you define yourself. So entities are a Drupal 7 core concept, and core provides this entity API, is how it's known. So those are the functions and hooks used to define and interact with entities, entity types, and bundles. And so far, everything we've discussed is part of Drupal 7 core, except for the examples of 5-star and CCK. Those are contrib modules. But not everything, this is true every Drupal release, not everything made it into core for Drupal 7, right? There are all kinds of great ideas and features that people want to get into the next major Drupal version, and they just, they don't always get in there. So thankfully there is this contrib module called the Entity API module. The machine name is Entity. And it's very confusingly named because it's the exact same thing as the core concept. And it basically makes dealing with entities a whole lot easier. So it provides full CRUD functionality. It allows definition of metadata about entities. And optionally, it makes entity data exportable, which is great for configuration, for example, that you want to get into your version control system to get pushed up through your different environments. And optionally revisionable, so think about node revisions and how you might use those. Well, actually, you can have any type of entity be revisionable, support revisions. There's also an optional administrative UI for managing entities. And it also has kind of extends the concept of entity types in an object-oriented fashion, which is actually something supported by core, but actually implemented by the Entity API contrib module. So a quick note on documentation. So documentation for the core Entity API and documentation for the Entity API contrib module are kind of separate. They're linked, but basically what I want to say is, don't get too confused. In practice, you're probably always going to use the Entity API contrib module in addition to core entities if you're defining entity types, just because it does so much for you. There's really very little reason why you wouldn't. So always install the Entity API contrib module, then you won't run into problems with entity function calls you're making not working because they're not actually core functions, they're Entity API functions. And of course, read the documentation to figure out what's where. So just a few examples of contrib modules that define entities. Now, of course, you can't have any of these in Drupal 6 because entities didn't exist. So only the Drupal 7 version of these modules will do this. So Drupal Commerce is a great example. They use entities extensively. So you've got a product, a payment transaction, and there are a whole bunch of other things that commerce defines as entities. Organic groups, you've got memberships and membership types that are entities. Rules, you've got rules configuration. So actually when you create a rule in the UI, and that's actually an entity, or when you export it, that's actually an entity. And so there are all kinds of things you can do with that. Message, which if you haven't used it, is a cool module for doing activity streams, kind of Facebook style type things. Uses entities for its message type, and message type category. So these are some good examples of modules you can go dive into and go look at how they implement entities, to kind of get a better feel with some real life examples of how to do it. There are lots. So we're going to talk about, we're going to go through an example here, and I'm using a previous project of mine, textbookmadness.com, as an example. It's still out there, so you can go take a look and see what it does. But in a nutshell, it provides classified listings for textbooks at schools, and it provides online price comparison shopping, so prices from a whole bunch of different online retailers like Amazon.com, textbooks.com, you name it. And what we're going to talk about today, specifically with Textbook Madness, are the prices that we display from the online comparison shopping. So these are fetched from a third-party API, and then they're stored by Drupal into our database. And hereafter, we're going to talk about these prices as being called offers. So when you think offers, think prices. So there are a number of ways we could define an offer. Right, we could use the UI to define an offer node. It's kind of probably our comfort zone is, well, you want data, you're going to go create a content type and put some fields on it. You could certainly do that, but there's a lot of overhead, right? Nodes are great because they come with all this free functionality. You always know when a node was created, when it was last updated, the author of the node. But those things don't always apply to all different types of data. So a few other things. You might not, in the case of offers, we don't need or want a page per entity. So we don't want a path for each offer. There's no reason for us to have basically a single price and information about that price on each page, which is by default how you would get it using the node system. We don't need or want revisions or fields. They're not useful in this use case. We don't need or want all that node base table information. It's just a bunch of information we're not going to use, and so it's going to be clogging up the database, dragging down performance, etc. So what we want is an entity. All right, now we're going to get into some code. Before we do that, questions about all of that stuff I just blasted out at you.
So I missed this part regarding fields. Are fields attached to bundles?
Excellent question, James. Yeah, so I neglected to mention that fields in Drupal 7, so actually let's go back to Drupal 6. So in Drupal 6 we have CCK, and so you created these fields that store different data. You might create an integer field or a text field or a bunch of different things, and then you associate those fields with different content types. So you might associate a taxonomy field with with a blog post content type, for example. In Drupal 7, you can do the exact same thing. And in Drupal 7, the terminology we use in the field system involves bundles. So it's not a content type. I mean, it is a content type, but it's also known as a bundle. That's the more generic name for it. And so where fields come in is you actually associate them with the bundle. So you can't associate a given field with all node types, all content types. I mean, you could, but it would take you a long time. It's not kind of like the usual thing to do. It's not the point. Similarly, you can't easily associate a field with just one, or with all of the bundles of a given entity type. You know what? This is getting confusing. It's a good question. Not sure if I'm answering it properly, but basically fields are associated with bundles. And remember, bundles are like content types, so they're basically subtypes of entities.
Can an entity belong to more than one bundle?
can an entity belong to more than one bundle? So an entity can have more than one bundle. So a node is a type of entity, and a blog post and a page are two different bundles
I see.
of type node.
Makes sense.
Another question? Saw another hand. No?
Oh, you have any idea what is this? So this was a pretty big change from Drupal 6 to Drupal 7. It was a radical change. Is this going to be refined or kept the same for Drupal 8? Do you have any idea of that? Have they improved or mucked around with the entity system?
They have absolutely mucked around with the entity system. I'm not super qualified to talk about entities in Drupal 8. I'm not really up to date with that. I know that there are other people in the room who are. But maybe that's something that we could talk about after we've talked more about 7.
All right.
But basically there are improvements coming. Maybe we'll open it up to people who know more about that at the end. Any last questions about entities, entity types, bundles, fields, how they all fit together, properties? We okay there? All right. We'll see how we go here. So here we are. We're going to implement our author entity type. So remember, this is to hold pricing information about textbooks. So the first step is you implement hook schema. I'm really bad at that. And this is just like any other database table. You don't really have to do anything special here, except you do need an ID. You need to define that whenever you define an entity. And in this case, I define that as a serial, which is basically an integer. That's by far the easiest way to do it. Technically, you could define an ID to not be an integer. However, it's very poorly supported by some contrib modules. So I don't recommend it. I recommend you always define your entity IDs to be numeric whenever you can. And then, we're dealing with a book here. So a book has an ISBN, which uniquely identifies the book. We've got a retailer ID. So that's a reference to some other data that represents the retailer selling the book. So in this case, it might be Amazon.com. We've got a price, and we've got a timestamp for when this offer was last updated. And we've got a primary key here, which is the offer ID. So that should all be pretty standard if you've ever implemented hook schema. Any questions about what I've done here? Maybe for anybody who hasn't done this before, that's totally fine.
So there's fields associated with the entity type. Is that correct?
Yes. So what we're defining here are the entity properties.
Okay.
So these are the properties that are associated with this entity type. And so we're building the table here, which is going to end up being called TBM_offer. And so these are the columns in that table that represent the properties for the entity. The entity type is offer.
So that field is not, what's it called? That's not entity fields, that's other fields.
Excellent question. So
Sorry about that.
Drupal, much like Microsoft actually, really struggles with naming. You get a bunch of people together and they decide how they want to name things, and they kind of do it in a box. So there are, I think, 3 different places in Drupal core in 7 where they talk about fields, and they're completely unrelated. So one are fields as we've talked about them, which is the evolution of CCK from Drupal 6. There are database column fields, which is what you're seeing here in hook schema. And then, I'm blanking on the third one. Where else do you deal with fields in Drupal? Views, actually not in core in 7, but in views, you deal with fields, which often map to fields from the database, but don't necessarily. Any other questions? All right, so now we're talking about entities. So as I mentioned before, we have to implement hook entity info. So here we're, can everybody see that okay? Is that big enough?
You can make it a little bigger.
I was hoping nobody would say that. Any suggestions on how I do that efficiently?
Use me sarcastic. Use me sarcastic.
I'm just going to yell it out.
There you go. Perfect.
So that first line there, basically in hook entity info, you can define multiple entities per module. So you've got some custom module you're developing. You basically need to return an array keyed on the entity type. And so we use a machine name here. My module here is has the machine name TBM for Textbook Madness. It's my custom module that I've built for the site. And so I prefix my custom entities with my module machine name. So in this case, TBM underscore and then offer, which is kind of the noun I'm using for this entity type. And return an array there. And so that array consists of a whole bunch of stuff. There are a whole bunch of options you have in terms of what you stick in there. But most important, you need a label. So wherever your entity shows up, you need some way of referring to it. And so you stick that in label, plural version of the label, then entity class. So entity here is actually provided, I believe, by the entity API contrib module. I might be wrong there. And so you want to use that because that gives you all kinds of extra stuff, all kinds of functionality we're going to talk about. Then the controller class, entity API controller. Again, that's from the contrib module. Provides all kinds of great functionality we'll talk about. Define the module that you're defining this for, which is TBM. The base table, that corresponds to hook schema. So we define the table TBM underscore offer. Here we're referring to that table as the base table. Fieldable, so this is where you decide whether your entity is fieldable, like nodes are fieldable. So a node, you can go into the field UI and you can add fields to different content types. If you want to be able to do that with your entity type, you set that to true. If you don't, you set it to false. Why would you set it to false? Performance. Basically, the field system adds a whole bunch of overhead. It's great, does all kinds of great things, but if you're defining a custom entity, there's a very good chance that all of the data that you want to associate with that entity, you're defining as part of that entity as entity properties in hook schema. Questions about that part? Hopefully I'm not talking too quickly. So that's if it's fieldable. So for offers, I have absolutely no interest in adding fields to my offers. All the information I care about offers, I defined in hook schema. It's going to be part of the base table for that entity type. So we're going to be good there. And then entity keys. This is where you define a bunch of other information about certain columns in the database table you've defined that represent something special in entity land. So the most important one is the ID. Every entity must have an ID. And so here we defined offer ID as the column in hook schema, where it's going to uniquely identify our offer entities. Any questions about implementing hook entity info? Yes.
You, in your previous example, you'd shown that there was another key in there that related to something in another table.
Yep.
Is it a good idea to put those into indexes?
Yeah, so for performance reasons, absolutely. All the normal database performance principles apply when you're defining.
Define those here or on the table?
No, that's all has to do with the database, and really the entity API, I believe, pays no attention to it. It will, of course, benefit from the performance gains when you're when you're actually querying for data. If you're querying for against that field or against that column rather, yeah. Good question. Other questions about hook entity info? Cool. So let's talk about some other things you can do in this hook. So if you wanted to make your entity type exportable, I've highlighted in purple here what's changed from the last slide. So the controller class, instead of being entity API controller, we set that to entity API controller exportable. And now suddenly, as well, when you set exportable equal to true, now suddenly your entities are exportable. You can export them as if they're configuration. They very well might be, into code. And down under entity keys, we have another special column we're referring to here, name. Now, for offer, we don't have a use case for that. We don't have a reason to export offers into code. It doesn't make any sense. It's really data, and we need to update them all the time. There's no point in having them in code. But let's say we actually had an entity that was information about the different schools, the universities that the website supports. That might be a candidate for exportable entity types, because it could be argued that that's configuration. You define which schools are enabled and which aren't, kind of configuration. So you might do that here. Questions about making entities exportable? All right. Also talked about making entities revisionable, which I'm not sure if that's actually a word, but so here, same idea. We don't need a separate controller class here. The entity API just supports revisions out of the box. And you just basically have to define revision table. So if you look at nodes, for example, there's another table, revisions. I think it's called revisions. Where you have all the different versions of every node that you have. Same idea here. And then you also have to define which database column on your entity table refers to the, or rather on the revision table refers to the revision in play. Not sure if that all makes sense, but that's the rough idea.
JD,
Yes?
the TBMO revision, is that a table created by Drupal, or is that something that you have to create?
That's something you have to define in hook schema.
Okay.
Yep.
And would it be any different than your original schema?
Yeah, so it would be an additional table. So whereas before we defined, oh, you mean would you change what we
Yeah,
defined
I mean,
before?
the structure is the same, right?
Right. I believe you might add the revision ID
Okay.
column to your original table. I
I
think you
see,
need
I
that. I think that's
Okay.
what happens in the node table. Yeah. There's a whole bunch of other stuff you can do in hook entity info. You can define a custom entity class that overrides the entity class provided by the entity API. You might do that to add some additional functionality or organize your code. Honestly, there are probably some better reasons to do that, but it's something you can do. Actually, I've got a good example of why you do that in a moment. Controller class, similarly. The controller class is basically what deals with the CRUD operations, maybe some other stuff too. I haven't dived too deep into that. You can define an access callback. It's the exact same concept as access callbacks everywhere else in Drupal. It's got a few different operations it supports. I think it's basically the CRUD operations. Can you create the entity? Can you update the entity? Can you delete the entity? Define that. Then there's that optional administrative UI that I talked about. So you define, where in the path that shows up. So that's, URL you navigate to actually get to that UI. And then you need to define a file where you define some of the form API forms that you need to show up there. Because while Drupal's great and it can kind of guess about a bunch of the stuff you're trying to do, ultimately, if you're defining a custom entity type, you're probably doing something pretty specific there. The different column types you define in the database may need different form field widgets, and there's a whole bunch of different stuff you may want to do there. And so the entity API requires that you then go and define those forms to get all that functionality. But what the entity API module does provide is it provides a default list view of all of the entities of each entity type if you define the admin UI in your hook entity info. And it also provides, I believe, the ability to delete them and create them. Delete them, and then creating and editing, you have to provide the form in order for that functionality to then be present. Does that make sense? Yes.
Is it basically a credit implementation?
Yes. Yeah. So basically, that's what it provides. It provides that programmatically by default. That's just provided by the entity API module. But if you want an administrative UI that allows the CRUD functionality, you then need to define what you see here in hook entity info, and then go and define the entity add and edit forms. Cool. Next, label callback and URI callback. So basically, this is where you can define what function gets called to provide a label for a given entity. So, for example, I could define a function that just returns offer. If I really don't need to label each of my individual offers, but I need them to show up somewhere so I can click on them, I might just say some function return offer, and then everywhere where that offer shows up, and I want to click on it or do something, for example, in the administrative UI, it would do that. Another thing you can do here is if you define it to be entity class label, as is written there. And then you define your own custom entity class. Then there's a function you can override called default label, such that everything just gets more organized, and it allows that functionality to be overridden by other modules. Same idea for the URI, so the path at which your entity is accessible. By default, entities don't have a path at which they're accessible. For example, offers, you don't want that. All right, so we're moving on from hook entity info. Any questions about hook entity info?
Told you guys it'd be a tech one this time. Told you.
I didn't lie. All right, hook property, entity property info. So there's another hook entity property info, that lets you define metadata about your entities. So stuff that you haven't defined elsewhere thus far. So that's provided for core entities by the Entity API module. So you don't have to worry about them. They got you covered. And then additionally, it's automatically generated from what you define in hook schema. So if you define a column to be an integer, and that column is basically maps to an entity property, then that entity property is assumed to be an integer. And so, for example, if you are dealing with that entity in views, and you're going to output a field in views field, for whatever that column was, it's going to know it's an integer, and so it's going to give you all the same options you get for any other thing in views that's an integer. So you get all that configurability for free because the Entity API module automatically defines that metadata based on hook schema. That'll all become clear in a moment. Now, that automatic generation, however, it doesn't understand any concept of foreign key relationships. So remember we had a retailer ID in our definition, and that was defined as an integer. As far as Entity API is concerned, it's just an integer. It doesn't know that it actually references some other data. It doesn't know there's any special significance there. Also, it doesn't know if an integer is actually a date. So for example, our timestamps has no idea. And so we fill the gaps. You can either use hook entity property info, or you can use the alter hook. The alter hook is great because then you don't need to go and define it for everything. You can just basically change the bits that it didn't get right. So you can reduce the amount of code that you write there. So a little example here. So here, there were a few different columns that we defined. I'm not sure if we mentioned URL in that previous slide, but there's a URL column that links to Amazon.com, for example, to go buy at the price listed. So the Entity API supports you saying, hey, actually that varchar, so I define it as a varchar in my database. That varchar, it's not just a varchar, it's actually a URI, right? It's a uniform resource identifier, is that right? And that means when you then want to list a bunch of prices with links in views, you can just do that without having to kind of, do anything special. As long as you've gone and defined the entity metadata, the entity property info for that column, you're golden. Similarly, here we're doing it for a date, so our last updated timestamp for that offer, you can say, hey, actually that integer is a date, treat it as a date, and everywhere it shows up, it'll be treated as a date, which is pretty cool. You can also set nice labels for things. If it didn't create a nice label from your hook schema, which is probable.
So does the type have to be picked from a pre-selected list of types?
It does. So in addition to URI and date, the other types supported by the Entity API are at the bottom here. So there's text, which a varchar would be text by default, be treated as text. Token, which is basically used for machine names. Integers, decimals, durations, which is kind of interesting. Booleans, entity is actually just means some entity. It doesn't mean an entity of a particular type. Struct, which is kind of a more intricate data structure. Honestly, I've never used that. And you can also define lists, which is interesting. And that list can be of any of these other types. So there's some cool metadata you can define there. So let's talk about that retailer again. Remember, we had that retailer ID that didn't refer to anything. So the standard way to do that is actually you leave that retailer ID alone, but you then come and define a new piece of metadata. We're going to call it retailer here. Notice that's different from retailer ID. So we're defining a new one here, and you can do that in hook property info alter. And we're defining that new property to reference an offer's retailer. And so we say, hey, the label is retailer, the type is TBM retailer, so that is an offer, or that is an entity type that we've defined elsewhere. And now that just plain old integer that we defined it in hook schema is actually a reference to another column in another table, to a whole other entity. So that's really powerful because then it lets you do things like relationships and views, and what else does it do? Here we go. I've got a list.
JD?
Yes.
Maybe take it up a level and just be like, talk a little bit about how this whole entity structure makes Drupal into a super powerful thing. I think I'm sort of like, I'm not able to grasp yet where the power of entities is coming in, and that's sort of what I'd like to talk a little bit about. Like, why is entities so powerful? You know, what the entity API rocks, you know, like.
Yeah. So actually this slide is perfect for that, because that's what we do. So I talked a little bit about views. So now we've defined all this entity property info. And so if I have a view of offers, I can then list the retailer as part of that view using a relationship, and include details about each offer's retailer. So just as you can with nodes, where you've got nodes and maybe you've got a node reference field or something like that, now you can do that with entities. And so, yes, you could do that with nodes before, but now you can do it with entities, which doesn't have all of the cruft, all of the baggage that comes with being a node. There's rules integration. Yes?
You know what, I think you skipped over this slide because somebody had asked a question.
Oh, yeah?
Okay, no, don't go back, it's okay. Can you just address the, what do you lose out if you use an entity? Like, I know there's a lot of overhead, but that does something.
Absolutely.
Right? But if you can cover that, that would be the most awesome.
Cool. Yeah, good question. Yeah, so nodes provide a whole bunch of functionality out of the box, right? You've got this great field UI where you can go in and, you create different content types, you define different fields that you associate with nodes. You don't get any of that with entities out of the box. That's where some of that overhead comes in.
So that's when you were setting up your entity here, and you said if you need an admin UI for it, you have to build it.
Basically, yeah. Okay. So it provides a little bit of structure for that admin UI, but you basically need to build the forms. So with nodes, those forms are provided by core, right? And that's how you get all that great node functionality that we all know and love from being in the UI. Yes, I'll come back to just more.
You do have to build the entity form, but the whole field UI you can attach automatically.
Right. Yep. Good point. Yeah. So you can get so you do get the field UI if you say your entity is fieldable, and you define an admin UI, and you define the forms for edit, add, and create. You can then you get that. Good point. You get the field UI, so you can then associate fields with entities. Examples of that: commerce, for example. You've got a commerce product. So it's a product on a site that could easily have been defined as a node. For whatever reason, they chose to do it as an entity. I suspect that some of that reason was performance related. Maybe you don't need to know when a product was last updated, right? There's a whole bunch of stuff you just don't need there. And so they went and built their own entity type and then did the work to define an administrative UI that was custom and different from that provided for nodes. So that's another reason you might do it. And they went and did a whole bunch of work there, and now they've got this great system that works really well. Is based on the same foundation as the field UI from nodes, but is different because it was defined to be different. Yes?
Were nodes versionable?
Nodes are versionable, yes.
And you lose that with the entities.
No, nodes are revisionable is the term I used.
Okay.
Also say versionable. You still have that ability if you define it to be, and you define another database table to store the revisions. And so there was a slide that we went through pretty quickly about doing that. Yes.
How big is the performance boost between using entities versus nodes? I mean, is it?
So the question was, how big is the performance boost for using entities versus nodes? The performance benefit completely depends on everything you're doing. So it's a crap answer, but it's the honest one, is you need to measure, right? If you do performance metrics on something you're doing with nodes and you see there's a whole bunch of time spent building node stuff,
Right.
maybe entities might be a good idea. But really it depends.
Can you
right?
cache on the entity level? You cache each entity field though, right? So you can set up separate
Yeah.
caching for every entity field?
Yes, there is caching available for entities. There's a module called Entity Cache that allows you to cache entities, per entity type, and you can actually define as part of your hook entity info if you have that module installed. Yes, I want this entity type to be cached. Now, depends, how much memory you have to cache it, depending on your backend for caching there. You're probably not going to want to cache all your offers, because there probably are hundreds of thousands of offers in your table. It's going to take up a lot of database space. A more reasonable thing to cache might be some configuration. So for example, we talked briefly about the possibility of having schools or universities for this website defined as entities. That might be a good thing to be cached, because you're going to be looking up school information all the time. There aren't very many schools. You can get rid of a whole bunch of database calls that way. Yeah.
Yeah, have you seen less support? Well, it's not less. It's how is the support in the contrib kind of realm for entities versus a node type thing, since it's historically node based?
Yeah, it's pretty good. It depends on the module. There are a lot of modules that have done the work to become more generic and support entities in general as opposed to just nodes. There are others that haven't made that jump yet. And I'll mention a few examples of some that have a little later on. Yeah.
So if I have a developer and I tell them to write a custom module with custom functionality, and the developer says, like, I want to just create a custom database table and just do it that way versus creating an entity.
Yeah.
Would you recommend me tell this developer to, yeah, you can do that, or you should actually do that with entities instead?
Yeah, so the question was, if a developer says, hey, I'm just going to use a custom database table, right? Maybe I'll go use hook schema, but I'm not going to use the entity API. The question was, well, should you say, no, you should go use the entity API? And the answer, again, is it depends. And one of the big considerations, again, is performance. So the node system has all kinds of performance implications on top of the entity system. The entity system has a whole bunch of performance implications on top of no system, right? Just the schema system. So the most bare bones you can get would be to not even use the schema system and just kind of do your own thing. That's probably not the good way to go. It's not doing things the Drupal way.
That's bad.
Yeah.
Don't do that.
Don't recommend that. For most use cases, I would recommend entities or nodes. Although, if you can't, for example, have a unique identifier for a data type, then an entity is not for you. I think a good example. What's a good example? Drupal things. Roles. So, well, role has an ID. Not a good example, but I'm sure you can think of one if you try hard enough.
Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah. Any other questions? All right. We're going to keep going. So then, there's all kinds of integrations you get from using the entity API. Views, rules, the search API. You get all kinds of integration there. Features, when you make entities exportable. Internationalization, that's supported by the entity API. The token system. So for example, here we have an offer. You can use the token system to refer to the retailer's name of that offer. That's jumping across tables, and it's using that metadata you defined in the property info. So entity field queries. So this is a tool for querying entities. So you can query entity properties as well as field data. So keep in mind, properties are on the table. Fields are like CCK. They're in their own tables. You can query field data across entity types. So for example, you could say, I want all pages and users tagged with a specific taxonomy term, which could be powerful. And the entity field query just returns entity IDs. You then need to go on and load those yourself, usually using entity load. Hey, more code. Sorry. So we'll run through this one pretty quickly. It's not that different from building a DB select query. If you've done that before, it actually can be a little simpler because you can do less. But it makes it really simple. So here we're getting the top 10 published page nodes with an awesome factor, less than 3.2. We could walk through this, maybe we won't.
Can you join with this entity field query?
No, it doesn't support joins, I don't believe, in the traditional sense. It does some joins for you. For example, here we're doing a field condition. So field awesome factor, that field is going to be stored in another table because it's a field, and fields have their own storage apart from your entities. So it will do the join between the entity table and the field table, but it's kind of done for you, which is good. It also means you don't have the same flexibility. So then, you build the query, you execute it, and then it returns the node IDs. And because it can return, or the entity IDs rather, because it can return IDs across different entity types, it actually keys it based on the entity type. So in this case, we were just looking for nodes, but we still need to go into the node part of the array to find the entity IDs for node. And that's so we know which entity IDs relate to which entity types, because you can't load an entity without knowing both its ID and its type.
Hey, JD.
Yes, sir.
I just want to interrupt you for 1 second.
Sure.
I don't know if people have noticed, but we have Dries sitting in the back. He's got about 5 minutes with us here, so I just wouldn't mind if Dries could just come up and just say hi to everybody before he's got to go to dinner. I hate interrupting your presentation like this, but it's
Come
so
on up.
rare that I get Dries coming to SF Doug.
Yeah, so I was in town. I didn't know about the meetup until this morning when John emailed me. So I tried to, do a quick surprise visit. I didn't want to interrupt the presentation. I thought it was excellent. Maybe one thing I can do for just a couple of minutes. I don't know if you have slides on Drupal 8.
I do not. I would love you to cover that.
Right. So maybe I can talk very briefly about what I remember changed in Drupal 8 relative to the entity system.
Yes.
And it's hard to remember all the changes because it's a complex system, and we've been working on Drupal 8 for 2 years roughly. So let's see if I can stitch this together a little bit for you guys. So one of the things we've done is we've actually turned more things into entities. So for example, the aggregator feed items as well as the feeds itself are now entities. So that's one little thing that I remember. Like fundamentally, I would say all of the concepts remain the same. So there's no, if you learn all of these things, most of the things will remain identical. So we added a few hooks here and there, which give a little bit more flexibility. So then we moved more things to entities. Oh, actually, yeah, one big thing which we did is we introduced the notion of configuration entities in addition to content entities. So we kind of split those two things off, and then we moved a lot of different things to be configuration entities. The reason we did is because we actually integrated the CMI system, Configuration Management Initiative, into I guess, entities. And so people thought it was really helpful that every entity automatically was, using the configuration management initiative or system. And so that's where, if I remember correctly, and I'm very rambled because I obviously didn't have a chance to prepare. And that's where this notion of a configurable or a configuration entity kind of came from. And so it's being used for shortcuts, it's being used for menu items, I believe we've converted to configuration entity as well. So you get a lot of the benefits. And think of it as a lightweight entity, and then the content entities are basically the things that were presented here on screen. What else? I think that's kind of what I remember, which, you know, so I don't think, oh, actually we also created new fields in the field API. Like there's a telephone field now which you can use. There's a couple of others. Remove date module into core, which, you know, makes it now very easy to add dates to any kind of entity, which is cool. So I would say there's, oh, sorry, as I'm talking I remember things. One other big thing is that we built this plugin system in Drupal 8, and we basically updated all of the entity stuff to use a plugin system, which you know, changes the API a little bit. It's a little bit more object oriented now, but fundamentally still works the same and is architected pretty much the same way. So that's kind of what I remember right now. Yep.
Dries, can you talk about properties and fields and how they're changing?
Actually, I remember reviewing that patch. I'm trying to remember how they've actually changed. I actually don't remember the exact changes. Do you remember?
No.
It's been a while.
Field access is unified.
If you don't use it every day, kind of. Sorry?
Property and field access is unified. Nodes just got converted yesterday to the entity NG system. So you access, you know, a node title and a node body in the same manner.
Right. There's more work to be done on that system as well. Like titles are still not fields, I believe. So something that we really want to get done. But it can still happen. So yeah. We did. Happy birthday.
Thank you.
That's today, right?
Yes.
There you go. It's David's birthday.
New Strauss.
All right. Any questions about anything? Or just the entity system? Or I'm happy to answer one or two questions if you guys want to. Nothing?
Not a thing? Come on, go deep, man.
Yes.
When will we ready?
That's always the hard question. The hard question.
That's actually so we're now we're in feature freeze, meaning we're not adding new features. Well, I have to find a new way to explain that because I changed the rules 10 weeks ago. But like, we're not adding features when we're over threshold, and threshold means, you know, if the number of critical bugs is over a certain amount, we're not adding features, and we're focused on fixing bugs. If it's below threshold, we can add some features to the release, and the threshold is going to be decreasing over time. So as we get closer to the release, there can be fewer criticals. So it's an incentive for all of us to try and, you know, work on critical bugs. Anyway, so that's where we're at right now. Feature freeze, so fixing bugs and doing polish, API polish. You know, could be tweaking our APIs based on you guys upgrading your modules. Could be tweaking the UI based on usability feedback. These kinds of things are still possible. So it's a great time to get involved and upgrade your modules. And then around July 1st, the goal is to get into code freeze, and then we do not allow more features to be added based on the current plan. We'll see how it works with the thresholds. But then, you know, obviously in code freeze, we'll focus on fixing bugs, and specifically critical bugs, with the goal to get to RCs, release candidates, by the end of the year, and then hopefully a release either, you know, just before the end of the year or somewhere in the beginning of next year. That's kind of the plan, but we'll see how it goes.
So I'm kind of doing Drupal development and Ruby on Rails development at the same time. And in the Ruby community, I noticed that there's a lot of people coming from university straight out and going straight into Ruby on Rails, and thus, at least here in the San Francisco Bay Area, the market is gigantic for Ruby on Rails. What kind of initiatives do you think are happening with Drupal to get, I guess, newer, fresher people into Drupal and expanding the developer community?
Right, it's a good question. Did everybody hear the question? No? So one of the big things that we're doing technically is in Drupal 8 we're adopting Symfony, which sort of modernizes PHP a little bit. So it brings a lot of the same design techniques or principles. Meaning Symfony 2 is different than Ruby on Rails. I think Symfony 1 was much closer to Ruby on Rails. But anyway, the idea is that we will make Drupal a little bit more easier to use for people that come right out of school, because it uses very similar design patterns that than those you can find in other sort of modern frameworks. So hopefully that will help. I think there's other things we can do technically. I think people fall. We need to win the hearts and minds of developers by providing a great technical platform, effectively. And Symfony is a piece of that, but there's more pieces to it. Secondly, I think we need more role models. Like, I see a lot of people in the startup community use Ruby on Rails, and so it's great to have companies like Pantheon and others, like real startups that, other than professional services companies, product-based startups, be successful with Drupal as a platform. And I think that will inspire more people to use Drupal as well. And then third, I would say, Drupal is an incredible career choice for people that come right out of school. There's a lot of demand for Drupal in the field. We need to do a better job communicating that to the students so they know that there's really great things to be done in Drupal, working with some of the biggest brands in the world, the biggest websites in the world. And I think a lot of them just don't know about that. So it's kind of a marketing thing, if you will. So
Thank you.
that's what comes to mind. There's one more question, and then I'll give you back the floor.
Any major changes in theming on going from 7 to 8?
All right, so the question was, is there any major changes in the theming going from 7 to 8? And the answer is yes. We've adopted Twig, which is a templating engine. And so that will basically change the way you do theming. I can't really explain Twig.
Well, Jen Lampton come in and explain.
She's here now.
No, she's not here.
Well, she's local, so you should
She'll
be
be
able to get her on stage here.
This is Jen.
Jen Lampton, yeah.
She helped us sprint here on Sunday.
Yeah.
Conversion work.
So there's a lot of activity with the new templating engine here in San Francisco. Jen Lampton, who I'm sure many of you know, she was one of the leaders and eventually got it pushed into core, I believe.
Yeah,
right?
she was taking the lead.
Yeah. So at Bad Camp this year, she was, hey, Jen got Twig into core kind of thing. So I'll have Jen come and do a presentation here so we can understand this new templating engine.
There's a lot of work.
Taking a spot there to jump in, Jen's actually doing a presentation on Twig at my user group at East Bay on the 27th. If you want to find out more about Twig, she's
Go. Awesome.
How's the adoption for Drupal as far as in a broader sense? I mean, like WordPress is here and Drupal's over here, and you give these great metrics, these great numbers when you go to the conferences, and it seems like the adoption is high in government and business. And how is your sense of that? I mean, how's the market share coming along with Drupal? I mean, is it still very, very strong, or?
So the question was for people in the back, how is my perception on the market share of Drupal and how is it evolving, and then specifically relative to WordPress? Is that right?
Not WordPress in general, but again, adoption across industry,
So
across the world.
Sure. So then I guess part of the question is how is Drupal in different industries? So first of all, Drupal is going really strong. I would say on the low end, Drupal continues to grow, but I see most acceleration actually on the high end of the market, sort of in the enterprise, in relative terms, maybe not in absolute terms, but.
Not everyone has the pleasure of being shoot off stage by Dries. All right, so I got one more little kind of mini topic here, and then I'll wrap up. And that is entity metadata wrappers. This is personally my favorite tool as a developer using entities. It's really cool, and the main reason why it's my favorite tool is because otherwise it really sucks to kind of deal with entities and fields programmatically. So let's go get into a little example here. So the scenario here is we want to get a node author's email address, and we have the node ID. So before entity metadata wrapper, you would do a node load to get the node. You would do a user load on the node UID. Then you would, do your check plane on the author mail, make sure it's not dangerous, and you've got your email address. Now that's not too bad, but it's one line shorter and a little more elegant with the entity metadata wrapper. So the wrapper basically just wraps any kind of entity, and you tell it what kind of entity you want it to wrap, and then you pass in either the entity ID or the full entity. So I can easily pass in the node object instead of the node ID here. It would work just the same. Under the hood, what it's doing there is it's being intelligent. So if I pass it the node ID, in some cases, it's not actually going to have to load the node in order to get at the information that I want from it. And so it does what's called lazy loading, which can have some performance benefits. Of course, there are also performance concerns because you've got this additional wrapper that you're using. But overall, it makes the developer's life a lot easier. And so here, once I've created this wrapper, which is just that wrapper equals entity metadata wrapper line, then I can go wrapper, and I want the author property. And author property is a reference to the users table. So it is based on the UID field, the UID column. And so now I've got a reference to, or basically I've got access to the node author, and from that I can get the node author's email address, and from that I say I want the value of that. So I get it. And I believe, and don't quote me on this and be secure, I believe that value there in that case actually does the check plane for you, or it might not be necessary, I don't remember. But it does some magic there that you need to be aware of and conscious of and make sure you know what it does. There are also options for getting out the raw value or forcing it to sanitize as well. So that's one example. Another example is setting a field here. So here I'm just going to set the node author's email address. And once I've got the wrapper, that's as simple as wrapper author mail equals. Really nice. None of those language none, 0 brackets, that's hell. It's horrible. This is so much cleaner, and it helps make sure that everything's there. It intelligently handles multiple value fields as well as single value fields. And here's a little more complex example. So it supports iterators. So if I've got a node that has a field called field taxonomy terms, I can actually do a for each on that using this get iterator function. And then term wrapper here is actually a wrapper of the taxonomy term referenced by the node, or each taxonomy term referenced by the node. So going through this for loop, I have access to the term, to the taxonomy term, from which I can get the taxonomy term's label and say, I want that value. So really powerful. It traverses that metadata that we said before, or that's automatically generated from hook schema. It allows you to do a lot of things in code a lot more cleanly and in a way that's a lot less error-prone than before. Any questions on entity metadata wrappers? Yes.
I have one.
Oh. In the back.
Yes. The question is about the wrappers. How you usually handle the exceptions that are thrown by them. For example, you are trying to use the property or the field that is not in the entity.
Yeah. So actually, John's got a mic there. Let's make sure everyone got that there.
Okay. I will repeat the question. It's about the wrappers. So my question is about the exceptions that are thrown by wrappers, because in case of like this, when we access a field name, like language null and blah blah blah, we just can do like is set and then we are done. But in terms of entity wrappers, we got those exceptions and we can get them on different levels. So how you usually handle those?
Quick answer.
You thought we were going to have easy questions.
I know, right?
I brought in my Russian team here to ask hard questions. That's right.
Appreciate that, John. Appreciate that. Honestly, I've not really encountered problems with that. Probably has to do with how my entities are defined and the fields I'm using, and exactly the logic I'm using. I'm sure that there are all kinds of exceptions that it can throw, especially because it's under the hood. It's dealing with the database, and it's possibly dealing with imperfect data and metadata. So the short answer is I don't know. I'm sure you can do a try-catch block on top of the wrapper and then do something logical if it fails. I know that the wrapper does return some kind of logical value sometimes if there's no data, but I don't know anything more specific.
Anyone else got any really super duper hard questions for JD?
John's enjoying this.
Hold on.
How does that work with multilingual stuff, since you're removing that language equals none type of thing? How does that, or does it work with multilingual?
So it does work with multilingual. The Entity API does support it. I've never dealt with that myself. I know John's really happy. But I believe that you can pass in, maybe to value, information about the language you care about, or actually you might pass it into the wrapper, and then the wrapper thereafter just deals in that language, and you can override it specifically. I think that's how it works. At a minimum, that's how it's going to work in Drupal 8, I think I read.
Got another one back here for you, JD.
Of course you do.
Looking for all the hard ones, bro, with the mic.
Oh, no, Howard. Okay. Let's say that you had defined a bunch of content types through the usual, Drupal 7 content type system.
Yep.
And you want, can you hook into that somehow through a wrapper and get your hands on that stuff in a entity-like way so that you can do that kind of updating and access and saving and all that?
Absolutely. So actually, all we're doing here, we're dealing with a node here. So we're not even dealing with a custom entity type here. The Entity API defines the metadata for nodes and for fields. So actually what we're doing here is we're just acting on nodes, and those nodes could have been created through the normal Drupal 7 field UI. And here we have a taxonomy terms field that could have been applied using the field UI. And so yeah, it's all supported. And you can mix and match between custom entities and nodes that you've defined in the UI. Yeah, James?
This is a simple question, I think.
That'd be great.
That'd be great.
Can you go back one slide?
One slide.
Yeah.
There. So people in the back can hear you, so otherwise it's gonna...
What is the difference between entity metadata wrapper and entity load?
Yeah, so entity load just actually goes to the database, gets all the information about the entity, including any fields that are attached to the entity, and you have a fully loaded entity object, which is what you're used to dealing with when you have a fully loaded node object. Same concept. With the wrapper, it postpones a lot of that data retrieval until it needs to be done. And so that can mean that you're actually not loading a whole bunch of stuff, which can be beneficial for performance and can be pretty cool. It also traverses the relationships defined in the metadata really nicely, which just given a node object, there's no way to do it. You have to do this node load, user load, kind of go through a bunch of loads, which is a whole bunch of separate database operations that the wrapper may actually be able to condense. I'm not sure if it does or not. It should.
Hey, JD.
Yes, sir.
Does entities provide any inspection capabilities?
Does entities provide any inspection capabilities so that you can know exactly what data is embedded in the entity?
It does. So instead of value, you could do info as the call, and that provides basically the entity metadata info as defined in hook entity info and as altered by different modules, hook entity info alter calls. And I believe that may also include the metadata from the property info.
So it's easy to see what's in there.
Yeah, so given an entity, it's pretty easy to find out what's there.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Thanks.
All right.
Anybody? Questions?
I see one in the back there.
A while back, I was playing around with the module called Entity Construction Kit.
Yep.
It's been a while since I've loaded it up, but can you kind of comment on that and just where it is and
Sure.
how helpful it is?
Well, sort of. So I've never actually used it, but I know it exists. Basically, the Entity Construction Kit, or ECK, kind of similar to CCK, but for entities, provides a UI to allow you to define entity types and fields and all that stuff. In much the same way that the field UI does. Personally, I don't have a real purpose to use it, and so I haven't. But I imagine that there are good use cases out there. Does anybody have one? I mean, they're certainly good for learning about entities. Are there any others that people know about? Yeah. I think it's pretty functional. All right. Hey, Entity Construction Kit, there it was! I know! All right, so we talked about that. Entity Cache, we also talked about. Entity Reference, so here's an example of a module that kind of came from Node Reference and has become more generic. So it deals with any kind of reference, and you can use it just like you do for Node Reference. It's just that you actually specify when you set it up in the field UI, I want to reference nodes, and you can further say, I want to reference nodes of bundle type or content type page, for example. But you can also use it to reference users, taxonomy terms. So it basically supersedes node reference, user reference, taxonomy reference, anything you want to reference. Then there's automatic entity label, same idea. Automatic node titles, which you may be familiar with. You have similar use cases for entities, and so this is a more generic version that just lets you define that across different entity types. So more information about entities. The documentation, there's lots and lots of information, and they're in a whole bunch of subpages, and it's a bit confusing, but the information is there. If you seek it out, I recommend diving in if you're going to get into this. Documentation for entity field query is somewhere else. There's the link to the contrib module page. This deck is on SlideShare. Search for it. I think you go to slideshare.net/JDLeonard or something like that.
I think it's also when you're in the meetup thing, I think we have links to your slideshows.
Okay, cool. And feel free to email me. So that's a whole lot of information about entities. Hope it was useful to some of you. And thanks very much.
All right, thank you.